U.S. imperialism and the Spanish-American War. From old diplomacy to new. From 1865 to 1900, the U.S. began to become more involved with global affairs. Industrial growth after 1865 led to the U.S. becoming a world power. Improvements in transportation and communication brought the world closer together, such as the telegraph, Morse code, the transatlantic cable, and better steamships. U.S. attitude towards imperialism. There was lots of disagreement whether the U.S. should adopt the policy of imperialism. There were some arguments for imperialism, such as it provided a new economic frontier, it manifests destiny and social Darwinism, it allowed for the spread of Christianity, and it could bring strategic locations to U.S. control. There's some arguments against imperialism, such as the U.S. should focus on overseas trade rather than political involvement. Manifest destiny should enter the U.S. Democracy would suffer with expansion and a general fear of war. The U.S. and East Asia. Here's some background. China and U.S. had good trade relations after the U.S. Revolution, and Japan was forced to trade with U.S. due to Matthew Perry. And after this trade was forced upon Japan, Japan actually started to industrialize. That led to Japan becoming a world power after industrialization, and they actually defeated China in the Sino War in 1895. China was split into spheres of influence by the major European powers and Japan. The U.S. became scared that their trade with China would be cut off due to the spheres of influence, so Secretary of State John Hay suggested the open door policy, where he suggested that all nations should have equal trading rights with China. Yeah, he pretty much got ignored. China got mad about everybody trying to control them, so the Chinese people started a rebellion called the Boxer Rebellion, where they tried to kill foreigners, missionaries, and they attacked foreign embassies. So the European powers and Japan and U.S. create an army to take down the rebellion, and all the powers except the U.S. forced China to pay for the damages caused by the rebellion. The China and U.S. actually formed good relations due to this act of kindness. Other Pacific overtures. Hawaii. Sugar farmers, with the help of U.S. Marines, overthrew the local ruler in 1893, but Grover Cleveland rejected the takeover since it was pretty shady. McKinley, who was the president after Cleveland, basically overrided Cleveland's decision and pushed for annexation, and the Treaty of Annexation was passed in 1900. Samoa, the U.S. wanted to make these islands a naval base, but so did Great Britain. There was a threat of war at some point, but in the end, they just ended up dividing Samoa. Spanish-American War. The causes for the war. The public sympathized with Cuba and the Philippines, who were both under Spanish rule. Yellow journalism. There was lots of propaganda about Spanish treatment over the Cubans. The USS Maine exploded, and the press blamed it on the Spanish. And the U.S. wanted to protect investments in Cuban plantations, and Cuba would make a good naval base. So that led to a declaration of war. Even though the Spanish agreed to Cuban independence at some point, McKinley declared war against Spain in April 1898. The Spanish-American War Part 2. Actual wartime. U.S. completely obliterated the Spanish and defeated them in 4 months. The war was fought on two fronts. Cuba and the Philippines. Both fronts were pretty easy victories for the U.S. Treaty time, 1898. The Treaty of Paris was signed in December. Spain had to give up Puerto Rico and Guam to U.S. Spain had to grant Cuban independence, and Spain, quote unquote, sold the Philippine Islands to U.S., but it was actually really cheap. Cuban independence. U.S. provided Cuba independence, but with strings attached. Cuba would lease or sell land to the U.S. for a naval coaling station. Cuba would not allow any other foreign power to acquire Cuban territory. Cuba would allow the U.S. to intervene when they needed to, so that the U.S. could protect their citizens. Cubans did not like these terms, but they were forced to abide by them. Debate over the Philippines and the Insular cases. There was a big divide in U.S. opinion on whether to leave the Philippines alone or to govern them. Anti-imperialists thought that we would be turning against democracy, and there was no point in mingling in Asian politics. Imperialists such as Roosevelt thought that U.S. acquisition of the Philippines and other Pacific islands was necessary for the U.S. to be a world power, and Philippines was going to fall to world power anyway, so it might as well be us. The Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, I think you pronounce it Aguinaldo, rebelled against the U.S. rule, but were suppressed by 1902. And the Insular Cases of 1901, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not fully cover colonial possessions. The extent to which a Constitution was applied to the colonies would be determined by Congress. Latin American affairs, the Roosevelt Corollary. Overview. The U.S. often saw themselves as the quote-unquote protectors of Latin America. On the flip side, Latin American countries despised this sort of mindset by the U.S. The Roosevelt Corollary. The first 20 years of the 20th century, the policy of intervention in Latin American countries would be used many times. Roosevelt feared that Europe might try to take political control of indebted countries, so he added an extension to the Monroe Doctrine stating that the U.S. might intervene in Latin American countries if its debts were super far overdue. He used his corollary to create protectorates of West Indies countries such as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Latin American affairs, the Panama Canal. The canal through Panama would greatly decrease shipping time and dangers of voyages, but Colombia kept on refusing Roosevelt's offers to lease the land for the construction of the canal. So, in 1903, Roosevelt, after being denied a lease, chose to support an uprising in Panama against Colombian rule. After the revolution, basically, he quickly got his lease for the land. The Panama Canal faced many obstacles such as malaria and yellow fever, but it was still completed in 1914. Latin American affairs, Taft and his dollar diplomacy. Taft would continue Roosevelt's policy of intervention in Latin America. Dollar diplomacy, there were monetary reasons for the policy of intervention. Taft thought that we should protect U.S. businesses that invested in Latin America. And he also thought that the U.S. had the right to force a Latin American country to repay loans owed to the U.S. And in 1912, he sent Marines to Nicaragua when a civil war threatened repayment of U.S. loans. Latin American affairs, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson did not believe in dollar diplomacy, but he did believe in keeping order. In 1915, he sent troops to Haiti when there was a civil war, and he did the same later in the Dominican Republic. Key point is that a lot of these countries hated the policy of intervention, especially when a lot of troops would occupy the country many years after they arrived. Wilson's biggest intervention was in Mexico. Wilson did not like the dictator known as Huerta, so when U.S. sailors were jailed in Mexico, Wilson occupied troops in part of Vera. Huerta ended up stepping down, but another foe popped up. Pancho Villa raided U.S. towns to make himself a national hero. Wilson retaliated, but to avoid war, he decided to withdraw troops and recognize the new Mexican government.